Okay. Yeah. Okay. It's totally fine.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Layla Goshi, editor of Bellady Magazine, and today I am so pleased to welcome Lena Mubsutina, who is the author of Amreekiya, an Arab American fiction novel. And welcome, Lena. How are you doing today?
Oh, thank you. I'm doing good. How about you?
Just fine. I'm happy to talk to you today. Wanted to just find out a little bit more about your experience as a writer in general and your experience writing Amreekiya and the response to your book. I'll say I really have enjoyed reading Amreekiya. I
Thank
enjoyed it
you.
when it first came out. And we will get to that, but I want to back up just a bit. I'll go ahead. I'd like to read your bio
Oh,
and
thank
then have a couple of other questions for you. So Lena Mubsutina is the author of Amreekiya, an Arab American Book Award winner, a finalist for the Lewis Merriweather First Book Prize, and one of Forward's four phenomenal debut novels. Her work has appeared in Cocoon, A Gathering Together, and The Offing, among others, and she's been nominated for two Pushcart Prizes. So congratulations on those.
you. Oh, thank you.
And Selena, one question I have really, I just want to start out with is when did you first realize that you wanted to write and that you enjoyed writing?
Well, when I first started writing, I was probably like 11 years old or something. So back in like the late 90s, and I did want to, I did want to do that as a career, but I mean, as you know, that's not always. I didn't necessarily think that that was possible, and I mean, even now, it's like, um, I do writing, but it's not, it's like in addition to my, other career. Um, so I think mainly what inspired me to first start writing was that, I really loved books, and I also wanted to, write something a little bit different than what at least what I was seeing then. I mean, as I've gotten older and have been more widely read, there have been more narratives I think that are somewhat similar to what I write. But at the time, I wasn't really aware of really just any um, well, really any authors of like Arab American descent at that when I was 11. But as the years have gone by, obviously, I realized that there have been some, and that there are continually um, you know new writers coming out. So that's great, and it's definitely like I'm aware more of the community as I've gone like further on in my career and just in my studies, like even before I was necessarily publishing, but just as I was in college, becoming more aware of that. And like I did my master's thesis on Arab American literature too.
Oh, that's great. In relation to that, since there wasn't that much Arab American literature available or literature that you could relate to, what area of the country did you grow up in? Were you born in the U.S.? And would you say that uh, regionally there was a lack of reading material, or do you think that was a national issue?
Yeah, so I was born in Sacramento, but I moved to Fresno, so further down the Central Valley in California, um, when I was like 3 or something. So that's where I grew up and everything in that area. And I still live in the Central Valley area. I live in Modesto right now. So I think as far as like what was available, I think that's for sure a national problem, because it's not that because this is what I kind of learned in college was that it's not that Arab American writers haven't been publishing a lot in the last maybe like 100 plus years. It's just that it's not, it's either sort of something that's de-emphasized, like their background is de-emphasized, or it's just it's not um, it's not widely available. Like let's say in libraries, or it's not part of the curriculum for like K through 12, especially.
That's a great point about their heritage being minimized. It reminds me, I'm only thinking of actors right now, but I'm thinking of like Danny Thomas and Marlo Thomas and how, I didn't even realize until much, I was much older that they had Middle Eastern backgrounds or heritage.
Yeah.
So, but how has your Palestinian heritage then impacted just your understanding of your identity in regard to having grown up in the U.S.?
Well, I mean, I definitely think being Palestinian and knowing uh being part of a group that's really not widely acknowledged as, well, not always being acknowledged as even existing in general. I think it definitely was something that made me like more of a, I guess a nice way to put it is like a critical thinker to see beyond just just exactly what was being reported, like let's say in let's say mainstream media, to know that there is, this isn't just like the complete full representation of the world. Um, I actually think that's like kind of a big part of why I became a librarian too. Just that understanding like information literacy, and also I used to teach English, so I think that kind of thing that um, was one of the reasons that taught me to be a little more to see beyond just exactly what's being fed to you, and I also think just culturally being Palestinian, I think just having that, connecting to like the folklore and the narratives, I think that was something that also just made me more like inspired me to write and that kind of thing.
Hmm. I really love that point. I think you're right that having that dual identity, I don't know if that's the only way we could phrase it, but I do think that having these competing narratives um, that we have to encounter as Arab Americans, I think it does enhance critical thinking. I do agree with you. I remember, I'd hear one thing at home, go to school, have a completely different representation of what was happening, in the Middle East and in other, areas of the world. And it was very puzzling until I started trying to reason it out. So that's an excellent point. And so that brings me to Amreekiya, your novel, which I hope I can, here it is. Hope I can get it on camera.
Oh, yeah, well, you see her full face.
There we
Yeah,
go.
just her
There
full
we
face, yeah.
go. Yeah. Um, I really related to this book when I first read it back in, I guess, 2019, 18 or 19. And because the character, Isra, um, her thought processes were so familiar to me. I felt like, well, I know I have had some of the same thoughts that she had. And what I thought made it, unique was her journey. But I want to step back for a minute and not characterize it myself. But I'd like to ask you to summarize the novel first. What is Emrikia about?
That was like, especially first, when you're querying the book and sending it out. That that actually was always something that stumped me too with this. I guess in the most simple, the simplest terms, it's about a woman of mixed white and Palestinian heritage who we see her marriage side by side with her looking back at her childhood and how those connect. Um, and basically just some like as far as like the themes, partially it's like what it's like to be an outsider, in multiple ways, and to also not completely go along with expectations from either culture that she's connected to.
Yeah, like forging her own middle path and individual path. And what I was going to say that I felt made it so complex for me is that she has experienced trauma uh, in her childhood, and I don't want to, give too many spoilers. I recommend everyone read this, but she's experienced some trauma, some emotional issues that she's dealing through, on top of also contending with different cultural demands, whether it's from her Palestinian family or from her own internalized American culture or Arab American culture. And that's what I thought made this so real. Because I think we all have that. It's easy to, it's easy to kind of say, well, this person is having this experience because they're struggling between two identities. And yeah, that can be true. But when you have other experiences on top of that, which I think most people also have. I mean, we don't have always just a straight line into adulthood. So we're always contending with different things, and so that's what really attracted me to Isra, the main character. But I thought all of the characters were true to life, and so one other question I have is, so you've centered Isra, an American-born woman who is of Arab heritage, Palestinian heritage. And why have you centered her experience versus, say, centering maybe the Palestinian immigration experience or diaspora experience? Do you know what I mean by that?
Oh,
What was your choice? Yeah. Um,
well, I don't know if I necessarily, like at the time I was writing it, if I was necessarily thinking of it as a choice. I think it was likely, um, that was something I connected more with, especially at the time. That was something I felt that I could write about. I mean, I think, um, I had been around a lot of, and I grew up around a lot of people who were immigrants, but I didn't necessarily feel like I could say I knew what it was like to be in that experience. But I didn't know what it was like to be around people. So I mean, that's why the many of the other characters, um, are immigrants, but she is not, and she's also mixed. And I think at the time, like one of my earliest inspirations for this, I think, was, to not to kind of show how being mixed a lot of times is about, it's sort of like trying to force you to choose one or the one or the other. And I think that, which that can happen, also it happens a lot in the like an immigrant experience, but I think, there is a different element to it when you're American born and you're sort of expected, like especially if you're, depending on how you look, if you're more able to pass as, like, say, being white, to like, why wouldn't you just pretend like you're white?
mhm.
That kind of thing.
Yeah, and I relate to that, and again, the character in the book, because at times she felt, I think she felt criticized or she felt judged, as she expressed it in the book, and I took that to mean that, you know, um, uh, I think both Arab American women and men have this experience, but very much a sense of that Arab Americans, American born, are sometimes lacking. There's this assumption that we're lacking something, either lacking the language or lacking a cultural awareness, an awareness of a certain cultural detail. And so I thought that was depicted very well because that, is an ongoing conversation. Not necessarily saying whether it's right or wrong. I understand the reasons. Um, I'm sure if I had moved to another country with my children, I could see them wanting to retain something of my, previous experience. But I just, I think that that was pretty well represented. And so, do you now, looking back, because I always ask authors this, and sometimes they say, looking back on the book you you wrote then, which wasn't that long ago. Um, First, would you consider a follow-up book in that world? And also, is there anything that you now see differently that you wrote in the book then?
Well, I think that definitely. I mean, it's still something that Amreekiya is still something I connect to, and it's. Um, I definitely got a lot out of writing, just writing it, not, and also publishing it too. That was definitely rewarding, but just the act of writing it and spending so long with it, like about 10 years or so, working on it, just on and off. Um, it's I think I definitely see changes in my outlook, and I think I'm also very, and this actually sort of happened in the, because I had been working on it so long, so it kind of happened in the middle of even writing it. Is that became aware of, I guess, of how young Isra was. I mean, at first, when I first started working on it, as an adult, she was actually older than I was, but when
Mm.
I was done with it, I was like several years older than her character. Um, so definitely, like her youth and her way of looking at the world, that kind of stood out to me more. Um, and I have thought about revisiting the story, because it is kind of, at the end, it is kind of left up in the air what happens in her marriage exactly. Um, but I at this point, I don't think I would write a follow up, because I don't necessarily think that there has to be that resolution at the end, as far as knowing exactly what happens. I think it was more the experience of getting there. I thought that was really what I was more interested in, um, portraying, and things like that.
Something I do like the end because I do like that it wasn't resolved one way or another. Because what that communicated to me was that, she's existing in this space. And there are many people existing in that space, you know, of trying to meld different cultural expectations in a partnership. And it works out differently for different people.
Yeah.
So I thought that worked very well, that it was more giving the reader a chance to kind of decide, you know, where do they think she's going to go from here. Because Yusuf, for all Yusuf, her husband, for all intents and purposes, is just a very nice guy. You know, I mean, and um, if you want to, challenge my interpretation of that, that's fine. But he seems like a very nice guy, but just has his own assumptions about how the world should be. And so that's what makes it so interesting too, I thought.
Yeah, I wouldn't challenge that. I definitely think that's and that was definitely like a very common perception of it too, and I agree with it.
Yeah,
I think it's just he's also very. I mean, that was another thing that kind of came to my attention too, as spending so long with it, I was suddenly aware of how young he was too, and also I think he's just um and I think he because he is a little bit older, I think he becomes a little more aware of not not necessarily thinking that his life should follow this tradition because in his case, you know, he was raised by both of his parents, whereas
mhm,
Isra, for the majority of her life, actually was not really. She wasn't raised by anyone who would, would have considered themselves even like a parent. They
mhm.
just sort of took her in. So I think that she wasn't as she didn't grow up with the expectation that she had to um, like continue the family name, that sort of thing. She was sort of just like because she is a more marginalized character than him. So I think that's why he had a more set idea, and then as he gets older, he realizes that this is not so easy and like simple to do, even though it seemed like that going into it.
Right. It just doesn't fall into place, and not really anyone's fault. It's a case of different life experiences. And so I did see that he was growing in that regard. And yeah, if Isra had grown up in a perfect world, you know, they could have come together and resolved everything very quickly. Resolved any differences very quickly. But his assumptions that everything was, you know, he was going to take care of everything and everything would be fine just was so totally not what she needed in her life to stabilize. So, yeah, just great. I thought that was great. So, I want to ask a couple of other questions, just in general about writing as an Arab American. Do you feel a responsibility to represent multiple aspects of Arab and Palestinian history? You know, how we were talking about um, you took you portrayed an Arab American woman's experience in Amreekiya. And so now, do you can do you see yourself continuing in that genre, or what are your thoughts on other um, representing other aspects of Arab American culture?
Well, I think that the the stories will will just end up representing certain things. I don't necessarily. I think when I was, especially like in my early 20s, I thought a lot more of, well, it has to be, you know, sort of like a balance thing. And I was very like hyper aware of what like non-Arabs would think of it. Because I think, um, you know, growing up Arab, you're used to, okay, well, someone sees one example of something, they assume everyone is like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think just as I got older, I just started, you know, thinking about that less. And I'm kind of more, I mean, I think just about things in general, I become more relaxed. And I think just whatever part of the story is, whatever part of the culture is represented, that's what's in there. I'm not necessarily going to jam things in there if they don't go along with the story.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I, you know, currently I'm not working on like the novel I'm working on is based on like Palestinian folklore. So it's not the characters aren't Arab American; they're Palestinian, but it's definitely something I would still write. And it's just that it happens to be that what I'm spending my time on right now
Mm-hmm.
is it something that came from folklore, but it's still also I think really about, you know, marginalized characters, people who, you know, they sort of view um, the culture from sort of like a insider's perspective, but then also feeling like they're not, they're not the most valued people in the society, and that kind of thing.
That sounds right up my alley. That sounds great, and I can't wait to read it because that's that aspect of critical thinking, that you mentioned before, um, where things aren't just one way. Um, and I asked that question because many times, as a writer myself and someone who's you know interested in all kinds of books and teaches literature, I'll get the same question often. Are you assigning Palestinian books? Are you Why don't you write about Palestine? And so there's always that balance as a writer of you know uh, wanting to maybe wanting to go down a different direction, but then also thinking of that audience and thinking, and by audience, I'm talking about uh, close colleagues and um, friends and so on. So yeah, have you ever experienced that where someone says, "Why don't you write about this?" or "Why don't you write about that?" And
All the time, even
all,
not just related to just like the creative writing. Actually, it makes me think of the first time I presented at an academic conference. And this was actually the first panel ever at this conference that focused on Palestinian American literature.
mhm.
And the first question that I got from someone in the audience was, "Why didn't we write about the Palestinian communities in Central America?" And it was just like, oh, okay. I mean, I can't encompass everything in here. And then, of course, it just follows you in like other ways. Like, why didn't you write about this? And it's
Yeah,
and especially, I think I think people who, if they're looking, I mean, literature for sure does represent culture, but if you want to know about a culture, you're not going, even if you're going to get it from books, you're not going to get it from one book. There's no way you're going to get it from one book or one article or one story. Um, the, as the person seeking out the information, you should be expected to invest more if you want to have this whole cultural understanding of something as like complex of what it's like to be a Palestinian American, or what is like the Palestinian diaspora experience, or what is it like to be a Palestinian in occupied territory, that kind of thing. Like that's you're not going to get it from one book. It's it and for sure I don't think you can get it completely even just from multiple books. Like I think you do have to kind of be involved to to
yeah.
get that.
And with that being said, I think it's important to support, for example, as myself, born and raised in Texas, maybe I'm not the best person to write about living under occupation in occupied Palestine. So then the real productive way to approach that is to support writers in in the occupied territories and share their work. So, but it's just interesting, the different dynamics. I think that we navigate, um, as writers. And so, I'd like to ask: Are there other books that inspired you as you began to write your novel, or even now with your current project?
Well, I mean, I really feel like there's certain amounts of inspiration, like kind of all the time. I know early on, like Naomi Shebnai was a very big inspiration of mine. And even though mostly she writes poetry, I guess thematically I connected to that, and I think also just even reading outside of like Arab American literature, um, like Julia Alvarez, like some of her work, some of the narrative structure she uses, That was something that I thought was really effective, and it was something I sort of incorporated into Amreekiya with Isra's past experiences being told in reverse chronological order. That kind of came to me
Mhm.
partly from that, and I think that's just sort of generally how just even reading now, and it doesn't necessarily have to just be books. Sometimes it's like just other media consumption, or just really even just life. Um, Certain things will make me think, well, this is good to incorporate in this book, and I also think just generally, I think engaging in literary efforts like recently. It's kind of been a while since I've been to a reading. I went to always like end of year reading, and there were a lot of great authors that are reading. I felt like that was very inspiring. It made me a little more
Mhm.
motivated to work on my my novel. Maybe not necessarily. I wasn't like emulating anything that was necessarily done in those readings, but I think just being around it is definitely an inspiration.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Um, so, speaking of writing, do you read or write in other genres? Like you mentioned, Palestinian folk tales. Do you have any interest in fantasy, sci-fi, romance, historical fiction?
Well, I mean, for sure, like historical fiction has always been a big interest of mine, and also recently fantasy um, has been like a thing that I've read in a lot, and I think that um, it's always been something I'm interested in as far as not fall because I mean, Amreekiya is it's told in the real world. There's no magic happening there, but
Mhm.
um, it's definitely always been an interest of mine because even in Amreekiya, like the when she's younger, the Isra she tells her younger cousin about she makes up like a fantastical story and that kind of thing, and I think it's something that um, I've become more comfortable with doing myself,
Mhm.
telling a story that I think includes these fantastical elements, but yet is still something we can connect to because I think that um, there's a little more like of escape. There's a little more excitement as far as like seeing something that's maybe wouldn't be able to play out in the real world, but you can see that there, and of course like historical fiction because I've always been like interested in history, so I think seeing like a narrative of that um, kind of makes it something that's easier to connect to and that kind of thing. And I wrote, I guess that one of the short stories I wrote that was published, I think 4 years ago now, the Invisible World of the Jinn. Well, the Invisible World. That was actually like historical fiction, which featured like a young character who she thought she was talking to the jinn. Um, so that wasn't necessarily fantasy because it wasn't like the jinn ever took form, but she went out there and they were like her imaginary friends, and that was actually set in 1920s Palestine. So I've done a little bit of writing in historical fiction too.
Yeah, yeah, very cool. So, so we've talked about the new project you're working on. My final question would be, what advice do you have for other aspiring fiction writers or nonfiction writers? Um,
Yeah, I think with advice, definitely. I mean, it depends a lot on your unique circumstances, but I think the main thing is I think what paid off for me was being persistent. It wasn't like for a lot of years I thought like nothing would ever get published because even like shorter work where I didn't really get them published or anything like that. So I think really being persistent and also really just I think appreciating. the small successes. Like, it doesn't have to always, be, um, it's not just only like, well, if you published a book or if it won an award, like that's not the only, um, really positive things that can come, even just from publishing, the publishing part of it, not to mention just the act of writing. So I think that, um, because I think the rewards in publishing can sometimes be few and far between. I think if you lose sight of why, and well, if you lose sight of like the joy of writing and like what it brings you, I think that that can kind of that can be difficult to deal with, especially if you're writing something that's not necessarily like mainstream, that's not likely to have like a lot of mainstream success.
Yeah. So when you pitched your book, did you send a full draft? Did you send a proposal? Was it to multiple publishers?
It was multiple publisher, and also like years apart as I like drastically changed the book. Um, but this, well, the version that's most close to what was published, that, um, I think I sent to a few publishers, and they all required like I think that's usually common in fiction. If it's like a novel, that they'll want um, the entire draft, and so that's how it worked. It it basically worked that way, and of course you wait, you're having to wait a while to hear back. So,
Yeah.
and, eventually I I did hear back from the University Press of Kentucky, so that was, I went with that as far as being published as part of their, poetry and prose series that they had just started, I think, a couple years before this was published.
Hmm.
So it was kind of a newer series at that time.
Yeah. Because I've heard from others who've had a book published that their first draft went through multiple iterations. Once it got to the publishing stage or the editing stage, I guess. With the
Oh yeah,
public.
and this definitely, Amreekiya did. I don't think really. I guess the content wise, the basic structure, it didn't change a whole lot. The title change, that actually came from the publisher. Amreekiya was not something I thought of. I thought it worked well, so I agreed to it. But so that I think that was probably the biggest change, and of course, it was just kind of like cleaning up any inconsistencies and just like wordiness, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um, at that point, so it wasn't like a super. Um, it didn't come out looking like a completely different book or anything after
Yeah.
that process.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that information, that good advice to emerging writers. And is there anything else you would like to share that I did not ask?
Well, I guess, so the novel I am working on, I mean, is tentatively titled "The Thieving Pod." I do have excerpts of that, on my website. It was
Oh.
also the beginning of it was mostly published as part of the Fresno 15 series,
Hmm.
which that's just like a creative writing marathon to raise money for a scholarship for MFA students. And also, other parts of the novel were published. The first part of it was published as The Thieving Pot, and the second one was The Beloved Tundra and The Beguiling Ghoul. So those are like excerpts from it too that were published, in different journals.
And
Um,
could you pronounce the title again? The Thieving Pod?
yeah, The Thieving Pot, like a cooking pot, because
Oh,
the main
okay.
character, well, one of the main characters is a cooking
Yeah.
pot. Um, and well, and because and the reason that the second excerpt from it is The Beloved Tundra is because tundra is a pot in Arabic, and it's based on a Palestinian folk tale about a pot that comes to life. But I mean, because it's a novel length book, it's not. There's definitely a lot of other characters who come into it, and we find out her origin story and origin stories of various other, um, well, characters that I've that are original to me, and also the woman who brings her to life, her mother, Zara. We see like their origin stories throughout the book, but still, the novel is like in draft stage. It's not finished. I'm not sending it out even yet.
Well, I think I've got your website linked in the information section of the
Okay.
this video. So definitely, I'll make sure your website link is there, just in case it's not. And that sounds exciting. I look forward to reading, the finished product. So,
Yeah.
but otherwise, Lena Mubsutina, thank you so much for
Yeah.
this opportunity to interview you. I'm very honored and just very excited to be able to learn more about your work.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was a great experience.
Thank you very much. Okay, bye bye, everyone.
Bye.